Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining our first breakfast session of the Eunomia Policy Talks. This morning we're going to be talking about socially inclusive and equitable policymaking in the waste and recycling space. My name's Michael Wasserman. I'm a senior consultant at Eunomia, and I'm joined today by Liz Start, founder of Start Consulting, and Sophia Huda, adjunct professor at Fordham University and Columbia University. So before we get going, can you guys please give a quick introduction?
Yes. Hello, I'm Liz Start. I use she, her pronouns with Start Consulting. I'm just outside of Portland, Oregon. I've been in the waste, recycling, reuse industry, circular economy for 21 plus years. So I've worked, my work has ranged from government to working for a private hauler to nonprofit and now into consulting. And so really have taken all that experience and, trying to work into our system that we're including equity and access and inclusion into our policy and into how we just make our systems work.
My name's Sophia. I'm based in New York, originally from Toronto, Canada. I've worked in recycling, environmental health, and environmental justice as well in a variety of locations. And I currently work on environmental health and international development issues.
Well, thank you very much for being here. So the first question, over the last several years, we've seen environmental justice, equity become a much more prominent consideration in the environmental policy space. The White House has started their Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We've seen several states have much more consideration for equity and environmental justice as in their policymaking. So do you think, you could share a bit more based on your experience how the field has changed over the last 10 or 20 years and how environmental justice and equity has become a much more prominent consideration?
Yeah, sure, I can start. So my work with environmental justice started almost a decade ago when I worked for Oxfam in the Middle East on water issues. I previously consulted with We Act for Environmental Justice, so that's an NGO based in New York, obviously works on environmental justice, and I was working on toxic chemicals and public health issues. And so obviously over time I've seen a huge more awareness of environmental justice, what it is, the need for social inclusivity and equity. But as related to the waste management industry, I think I see more of a recognition of why that's important for successful programs and policies and to implement them successfully.
So for me, when I first got started in the waste and recycling industry, I was generally the only woman in the room and definitely the only person of color in the room. So I've seen a huge shift in that, and each conference I come to, definitely seeing a lot more women is amazing, and slowly seeing more and more folks of color getting into this work, which is really great. But I think more importantly is the access to recycling systems. There's been a huge shift, early in my career when I would try and talk about multifamily recycling, I would just get the response of, oh, it doesn't work in multifamily. And so it was just easy to brush it off because it was too much work. So now seeing a lot more shift in focusing on how we're creating access to systems, especially folks who are living with lower incomes, high, populations of vulnerable communities, especially folks of color who are, in burdened areas as well. Oh, thank you.
Thanks. And, the goal, I think, is to create inclusive, equitable policy, but to do that, we've talked before, you really need to have that process of making legislation also be inclusive and equitable. So, the question is, how do you really do that? How do you get people involved from the start? How do you create an inclusive space to make sure you're hearing all views? And, where in the process do you need to get people involved to ensure that end policy is equitable? Liz, maybe start.
From the very beginning, that is when you get people involved. That's easier said than done. I get that. And I think that as you all are working on policy, is focusing on how you get it built in from the beginning, make sure you have budget and time, because those are going to be your two biggest things. Figuring out how to compensate folks, especially folks who have been burdened by our systems and not had access. You need to compensate them for their time. If you're getting paid to talk to them, they should be getting paid to talk to you. So don't put the burden on the people to just give you their information for free. So making sure you're thinking about that throughout as you're building that in with policy.
Yeah, I'd agree. From the very beginning, when your objectives are set, your budgets are set, and you have to look at it holistically as well. You can't just look at waste management or sanitation in a silo, but as part of your larger community and how it operates, its needs and its wants as well. Instead of just looking at waste management goals exclusively.
Yeah, and Liz, you mentioned you have to include it in your budget, and I think that takes a lot of time as well. It's a longer process to get everybody's input. How do you convince the people you're working with or policymakers that this is a worthwhile investment in both money and time?
That is a tough question. I think I'd be changing the world if I could figure that out. But I think that it's definitely having the conversations, keeping this top of mind, talking about, especially to, local legislators, how it impacts their local communities is really, because that's what should be speaking to our decision makers, is how it impacts the people that they work with. And so, understanding what those communities need and what they actually want, not telling them what they want, and communicating that with the legislators and bringing them into the conversation too to advocate for that.
Yeah, there's also a growing trend towards the de-privatization of a lot of public utilities. So one example is the water utility in Paris, and they have a very democratic, participative model. It's not easy. As Liz said, if anyone has participated in community meetings, there's a lot of people who want to talk, and it can be really difficult. But the thing is, if there's no models, there's no one-size-fit-all models for participatory policymaking. But the thing is, if governments don't try, and they don't test these out, and they don't use and apply the theories that all these academics are writing about, then we can't have successful models. We can't talk about successful models and how they work. So my advice would be just try, as time-consuming and frustrating as it can be. But then, what else are you there for as a policymaker? But not to make policy for and with the people, right?
Definitely. And, when we were organizing this panel and all of our panels, it was really an eye-opening experience that we had several people unable to attend or unable to accept our invitation based on not feeling safe within the state because of the policy set here, and that has excluded some people from joining, this conference and this policy talk session. So I think it's really difficult to understand who's not included when you're trying to create an inclusive space. So how do you set up a system so you understand, who may not be included in the process, even if you're trying to create an inclusive process?
I'm going to kind of answer that. Because I think we have to look back at, how harmful legislation and systems can be, especially on communities. Like, being from Oregon, you'd think oh, it's this great hippie paradise. The state of Oregon was founded on horribly racist tenets. Black folks weren't even allowed to come to the state until the 1900s, and I think it wasn't until the early 2000s they actually took that out of state law. And we're seeing the impacts of that cascading even now in our waste and recycling system, where there's only one Black-owned garbage and recycling company in the state of Oregon. And they're smaller haulers, but large haulers. And, and I have folks ask me oh, how do we get more, Black and brown-owned companies to come work with us? And it's we've got to address the past issues too and realize how harmful legislation can be and how it really can impact that.
Yeah, I think it's a recognition of the role you play as government and how you will be viewed by society and all sectors of society. But I think also on a more micro level, it's just ensuring that when you have meetings within your organizations, within your departments, that you are setting up functions so people can participate in a variety of ways, that they know that their voices can be heard and that they feel comfortable to express them. So, for example, when you write into your city councilor, please write back. So they know that, we are open to hearing your voices.
So we talked a bit about how to create a space for inclusive policy design, but hopefully now we can maybe shift to what good policy looks like. What does inclusive policy look like as an end goal? So hopefully this conversation we can kind of go through the circular economy value chain. So maybe if we start kind of upstream in terms of reuse, repair, how does an inclusive policy ensure that those systems are allowed and included within the system?
Well, like Sophia said, it's not a one-size-fits-all policy, so it can't be so prescriptive. In my work in reuse and like the repair community, it's a lot of times of like, oh, here, let me gift this service and these to you, instead of actually working from the ground up with community, and so it brings in that community of involvement. In Washington, I was part of a study on how reuse and repair systems build resilience in communities that have been under-resourced and overburdened. And they've decided, hey, if we're not going to be given, the resources that everyone else has, we're just going to do it ourselves. And so bringing those folks in is how we can, work on creating that policy. Again, there's no perfect policy because each community has different needs, but how do we create an umbrella policy that makes sure that folks all have access to the resources?
Yeah, exactly. Your policy needs to be informed. You have to have data. You have to go out and research the people that you're trying to serve, what their wants and their needs. And the thing is that, if you have informed policy, if you put that groundwork in, then it helps inform further policies. It helps you go for more ambitious policies down the road if you better understand your community. But you can't make policy that's not informed by data, by perspectives of your citizens.
And Liz, you mentioned earlier, that multifamily housing weren't included in collection systems. So if we look at, equity and inclusion in terms of collection, especially when it comes to EPR, a lot of states now are developing EPR policy, drafting what that looks like in terms of access. So, do you have any thoughts on what, inclusive EPR for collection systems, what does that look like?
Well, it has to address all the systems, and you have to use a systems lens on it. So when I worked for a hauler, our biggest issue was enclosure sizes, especially for multifamily. And you can't have access if you don't have the infrastructure in place. So it has to include infrastructure in order for these systems to work. Otherwise, as any of you who may work in multifamily, like you can keep trying all these great education programs all day long and keep throwing money at it, but if you don't have that infrastructure in place, it's not going to work. So making sure that it includes infrastructure.
And then, at the end of life for a lot of these materials, they still need to be recycled, they still need to be processed, and the U.S. has quite, a history of placing these facilities in overburdened communities, environmental justice communities. I think, 79% of incinerators in the U.S. are located in environmental justice communities. So how do we ensure that, at the end of life, it might be collected from everybody in an inclusive manner? Everyone might be involved in the process, but it still needs to be recycled. It still needs to be managed at its end of life. How do we ensure that, those solutions don't negatively impact, overburdened and environmental justice communities? Maybe Sophia?
So if you consider equity from the very beginning of your policymaking, then something like that would come into consideration, right? That if that's a factor in your decision making. On the other end, New York State and I believe New Jersey also have developed a cumulative impact bill. And so what that means is that when you do siting of these sorts of facilities, you're considering not just the environmental health impact of the facility on its own, but all of them for a community. Now, this is considered pretty progressive policy, but it's actually very basic. I mean, not to have considered that, you have an incinerator, then you have a bus depot, and then you have something else that is going to contribute to a lot of pollution. It's amazing that in 2023 that we only thought that maybe we should consider them all in one go. And then, of course, in lower income communities where these are often cited, there's other environmental health factors that impact health, and you see data that shows exactly the impact on life expectancy, on childhood development, etc. So as a very basic, the idea of looking at a cumulative impact for siting of facilities should be standard for everywhere in the country and globally. But again, you start with equity, then you don't run into these problems at the end of your planning.
And I think too, it takes extra work and it's extra steps. When places are looking on where to site their facilities, the squeaky wheel gets the attention or the grease, right? Like the NIMBY folks who have a lot of privilege, a lot of time and capacity to pay attention to these issues, those are the ones speaking the loudest and saying, don't you put that by me. And the folks who are already overburdened, working multiple jobs, trying to figure out how to make ends meet, they don't have the capacity for this. And so we're just adding one more layer on top of that by doing these things and not, including equity from the beginning. So really being thoughtful and, it's building out enough time to actually have conversations, to build relationships. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, especially to government, is how are you actually building relationships with communities who are impacted by these systems.
And I think, in the circular economy space, we focus a lot on the material itself. We talk a lot about what is the loss rate of plastic when it's going through a recycling plant, but sometimes we miss in the conversation the workers and the humans that are part of this process, the people collecting the material, recycling the material. So how do you ensure that they're included in the process as well, and we design systems that are also good for their health, good for their wages as well?
Policy, in Oregon, that's, part of the conversation. I went on a MRF tour many years ago, and it was just, it's a hard job to stand on a sorting line. And this company, they wouldn't have the folks work any longer than 5 hours, so they weren't required to have lunch breaks. And, it was such an intense job. And so it's like, how are we paying folks who are, basically dealing with our discarded waste, even though it's being recycled? How are they getting livable wages? How is this a job that's actually going to feed their families and take care of them? And also, how do they have the protections in place to take care of their bodies as well? Because it's a very physical job. So, building that in, too, and also holding, processors accountable, too, to take care of those folks. And sometimes that's going to impact the bottom line, and I think that's, a lot of times where the decision points are.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's the role of the government, of the policymakers, to make sure that that when they talk about an equitable system, that they're looking at also these private sectors, and that they are also contributing to that equity, and that they're practicing that in their policies within their organizations.
Great. And maybe just one more question before we move to the audience. How do we measure equity? It's very difficult. We can talk about this. We want to have people included, but when it comes to policymaking, how do you keep people accountable? Is there any metrics to ensure that, we're keeping up with the ideals we're talking about to measure it quantitatively?
So I'm going to quote a friend of mine, Dr. Lillian Copenhagen, who does equity analytics, and she said, when the inequities in the system don't impact the outcome, and for me, it's like when I'm talking to folks, it's what are we working towards? What does an equitable system look like? It's not, oh, look, we had 12% of the BIPOC population started recycling. Yes, those are measurements, but we're also talking about people who've been excluded from the system for so long. So I think it's working towards a broader goal, but I know that data is what informs policy, data is what informs these systems. So it's looking at, okay, who is the most under-resourced in your system, and how are you helping those groups get full access that other folks in, areas that have had the systems all along are getting access.
Yeah, I agree, and also to look at it holistically. So nice quantitative data points are good, but you also have to look at it, do I have buy-in from these communities that have been excluded? Have we done our best efforts to reach out to them? And just, be honest with yourself. Ask yourself, do we actually talk to the people we never talked to before? Are we actually listening to them? Are we integrating their ideas? Let's be honest with ourselves. So, quantitative measurements and all sorts of ways of calculating them are good, but being honest and looking around sometimes and asking yourself, are we being inclusive and equitable with what we're doing is important as well.
Great, thanks. So maybe if there are people who've had a couple cups of coffee, have any questions in the audience, I think we're happy to open it up to everybody.
You mentioned paying people to listen to a talk. Could you just expand on that a little bit, how you would do that?
Well, and I would say more to engage with you. So a lot of the engagement that I do, or individual interviews, one-on-one, or like focus groups where you're getting folks to give you input, it's important that they're compensated for their time. A lot of times, especially when we're talking about working with communities of color, we're asking them to like relive traumas of like their experiences that they had in order to make the system better. And that's a lot of emotional labor. And so to say, hey, we want you to volunteer to do this, that's asking a lot of folks who haven't been included in the system. And like, yes, you have folks who will readily volunteer to do it, but especially if you're asking folks to come meet you somewhere or be part of a focus group that's in person, you know, if they're having to figure out childcare, transportation, maybe take time out of their job to participate, that's how you can, you know, make it balanced.
Anybody else? Questions?
I've got a question then. Are there any good examples of engagement that you could highlight, or any municipalities or states that have done what you think is a good job or a good process, and how long has that process taken? Because we did talk a little bit about time, and I know that's super important.
No.
Okay. So in Washington, there's a program called Next Cycle that I'm part of, and what really attracted me to this, being part of this project, was that they integrated community co-design. And so there have been different iterations of Next Cycle, but Washington's the first state that it's been done in, where folks that represented communities, especially communities of color, low-income populations, rural communities, were brought around to help design the program. So it wasn't top-down, it was including community throughout. And so, you know, it's not a perfect process, it's iterative, but definitely, you know, having community at the table as you're having these conversations. Understanding, too, there's going to be a level of engagement that also needs to happen to kind of give them, you know, the information that if you work in the industry, you know, but, you know, to a lay person, there might be just a little bit of extra time. But folks have so many great ideas and input that they want to give in to be part of it and to build systems that will work for their communities. So, you know, that's a really great system that I'm excited to see kind of grow and iterate.
I liked the recycling partnership. So just a little plug, I'm part of the National Recycling Coalition. We have our Congress in December if you'd like to attend. And last year we talked about outreach to underserved communities, and someone from the Recycling Partnership talked about their program that goes and uses very specific icons and images to help different communities understand how to recycle specific products that they buy. And I quite like that because, even if you just put one thing that you can find in a Vietnamese grocery store, an Indian grocery store, it might not be everything that they're recycling, but it speaks to them. It says, you thought about me, I'm part of this, this is something I identify, and it'll help create that kind of buy-in. So it's not a lot. That does take some work. It's not a lot, but you just have to make people feel included in all of this.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Liz and Sophia, for joining us this morning, and I'm sure you'll be hanging around if anyone has any other questions. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And I think our next policy talk is at 12:30, so hope to see you then.